All right, there we go. Hello, John S. Rhodes here. And did you know that your starting dividend yield can completely change your financial future? It's really shocking to me how much that starting yield matters. And most people overlook the starting yield entirely for a variety of reasons. Now, here's the most crazy part of all. I'm going to break down exactly why starting yield is just so dang important and why it's so powerful. Also, how dividend growth rates play into the starting yield and why these numbers really could unlock very serious wealth for you. The starting yield, though, is the mind-bending number that I'm going to work through with you in this video. I'm John S. Rhodes of the Rhodes Brothers. This is Greater Wealth Through Mastery. And after spending time with starting yields and dividend growth rates, I came to a shocking conclusion. I'm going to prove to you why starting yield is possibly far more important than dividend growth rates for many investors. Perhaps not all, but many investors, and that could mean you. So stick around until the end because I'm going to show you a very simple method to understand how to even accelerate your gains that much faster, especially in light of dividend starting yield and also dividend growth rates. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over to a full screen presentation. You'll be able to actually see the screen and see the numbers that I am talking about. So just give me a moment and I'm going to switch over to that screen right now. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it so that I can see it as well, and we're going to dive in together. Now, the very first thing that you should see here is, and this is pretty important, so I want to focus on this, is $10,000, which is really not critical here. What matters is we're looking at 3% for the current dividend yield and 3% for the dividend growth rate. Then we've got 2% for the next line, which is the orange yellowish line there, 2% for the starting yield and 2% dividend growth. So as you would expect, over 20 plus years in this case, or it could be quarters or even weeks, who knows, right? Depends on when the compounding's happening. You've got 3%, 3%, 2%, 2%. This is what happens with 3%. So this is exactly what you would expect. You would expect over time that the 3% would win. It would do much better than the 2% and 2% growth rate. Here's what's wild. I'm going to do this immediately. We're going to cut right to it. If I do something here and I change this to, let's say, 5 for the starting yield, and I leave the current growth rate of 3, what do you think is going to happen? Well, it's pretty obvious, right? Because we're going to start at a higher number, and that's going to make that blue line even further away than the orange line. And if I do something like this down with the orange yellow line, if I make that suddenly, let's say rather than 2 and 2, I make it, I don't know, maybe 2 and 5, right? 2 and 5, and I generate, you see that they're parallel, very important. You can see that they're parallel because the growth rates, yeah, they're kind of close to each other, but you're starting at 5, starting at 2, so they're kind of close. They're kind of parallel. So there's nothing new here. This is the important point right now. There's nothing shocking right here. What comes next is shocking, absolutely shocking if you ask me. If I change this to 7, so again, the blue line, current yield of 7, and I leave the dividend growth rate of 3, and then for the yellow orange line, I change the current yield to, let's say, 3, and then the dividend growth rate of 7, you should be able to kind of think about what's going to happen here, right? The blue line is going to start off higher, and the orange yellow line is going to start off lower, but it kind of intuitively makes sense that eventually the growth rate of the lower yield is going to make it so that we have this activity happening, this compounding happening of the yield, so that it's going to cross over. Like intuitively that makes sense, right? Because the growth rate is 7 versus 3. So even though we're starting higher with 7 and the growth rate is 3, we've got 3 and then 7 for the growth rate. So wildly faster growth rate, but it's 7 and 3 and 3 and 7. So you'd expect a crossover. The real question is, when will the crossover happen? Really soon? It kind of intuitively makes sense, right? 7 and 3, 3 and 7. Let's see what happens. Shockingly, this blew my mind. If this doesn't blow your mind, honestly, I don't know what does, because it says to us that there's not a crossover for 22 years. Putting this in perspective, if you have a stock that pays 7% and that yield grows at 3%, you will be pulling in more dividend money. Okay, you'll be pulling in more dividend money for 20 plus years. It's not until those 22, 23 years where you have the crisscross, where there's the crossover, where the dividend growth rate being really high and really fast makes a difference. Over 20 years, you would be collecting more money. And this is why people who are looking at dividend growth rates and saying, I want high dividend growth rate. The starting dividend, it doesn't matter. But if you're looking at current income, and that means all the way through median time frame of income, like the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 15 years, heck, even 20 years. Maybe you're getting close to retirement, maybe you're in retirement. A higher starting yield looks like this: 20 years of greater payouts. It takes that long for the dividend growth rate, the very, very high dividend, well, the relatively high dividend growth rate, to make up for the very high starting yield. This blew my mind. Frankly, it blew my mind when I saw this. Now, we need to continue on, and this is the biggest mind bender of all. If I reinvest all the dividends, okay, if I reinvest all the dividends with the 3% starting yield and the 7% growth rate, and I'm doing that, you can see what happened, and I'm doing that with only the fast growing dividend, 3% and 7%, and I reinvest all the dividends, I'm still collecting more dividends for 13 years, at least 12 to 13 years, and that's with all of the dividends reinvested. 3% starting, 7% growth rate, all dividends reinvested, and I'm still better off starting off with 7% and 3%. Now, you know what's going to happen if I reinvest all of the dividends from the high dividend paying stock with the slower dividend or the lower dividend growth rate. You know what's going to happen, right? You know exactly what's going to happen. Let's do it. Maybe you didn't know that. It never will catch up, because you can see the slope, it accelerates. So in other words, the 7% starting yield with a 3% growth rate, and then the dividends reinvested, if that's what you're doing, those dividends, that cash flow from the dividends will never catch up, right? Or it'll always be ahead. In other words, the 3% and the 7%, it'll never catch up. The low dividend with the high growth rate, when they're both reinvested this way, 7.3 versus 3.7, the 3% starting and the 7% growth rate will never catch up. That's how powerful the starting dividend yield of 7% with just 2% growth rate, how much it matters, especially when you add in the dividend reinvestment. All right, now here's the next thing. If I lower the dividend growth rate down to 2, what do we get? Still doesn't catch up. If I lower the dividend growth rate down to 1%, guess what? Still doesn't catch up. If there's no growth whatsoever, 0, it will eventually catch up. You can see 7% starting yield, no growth in that. So that's 7%, 7%, 7%, right? It's always, you know, $7 out of every $100, $7 out of 100, 7, 7, 7. It never goes up. With reinvestment, yeah, fine. If I reinvest, it'll eventually catch up. In other words, the starting dividend yield of 3 and the starting dividend growth rate of 7 with reinvestment, it'll eventually catch up. But you can see the extreme disparity here as soon as I add even like 1% back. If I add 1% back and if I make that 2%, I mean, it just never catches up. It never gets there. So let's do it a different way. Let's do this. Let's start with, let's say, I don't know, maybe 5%, and we'll leave it at 2% and see what happens. All right, so there's crossover right here. And if I eliminate the dividend reinvestment, well, in that case, it happens pretty fast. But this does go to show you exactly what ends up happening when you have a high dividend starting yield and just very modest dividend growth rate, and you reinvest right there. When you reinvest those dividends, if that's something that you're able to do, your cash flow is looking really, really good. And as that dividend goes up, right, and we'll go back to the 7 and 3, it's just a thing of absolute beauty. So that's what I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you just how critically important it is if you're an income investor. Perhaps you are nearing retirement or you're in retirement, you need to take a very close look at the starting yield. You need to take a look at the dividend growth rate, but the starting yield is so critically important. And then what is your ability to reinvest those dividends? Now, obviously, I didn't talk at all about, taxes or tax sheltering in any way. We're not going to cover that in this video, but I did want to show you just the raw numbers, the real numbers here when it comes to dividend starting rate, the dividend growth rate, and then the reinvestment as well, and how that can just have a truly profound change in the amount of income that you're able to pull in, and how to think about maybe looking for higher dividend stocks for current income, how to think about reinvestment, how to be looking and filtering for stocks that have these kinds of dividend growth rates. Okay, now another part, just before we conclude, I want to make this clear as well. Most of the great companies out there that have paid dividends, growing dividends year after year after year, they're going to yield somewhere between, let's say, 2% and 5%, somewhere in there. So as you are getting over 4 and 5 and 6%, you do need to realize that the risk does go up. At least it can be the case where the risk of a higher starting dividend yield could be putting pressure on you in a variety of ways. So it's not all rainbows and butterflies. You do have to be aware of the kind of companies that you are investing in. You have to be aware of things like the payout ratio. You have to be aware of the credit rating of the company. And there's lots of different ways to evaluate the companies. But we wanted to look together, you and I, we wanted to look at the current yield and the dividend growth rate, show you the math, and also what dividend reinvestment does for you as well. So thank you very much. One more time, this is Jonas Rhodes of the Rhodes Brothers. Please like this video. Let me know if you like this style of video as well. If it's really useful for you as an investor, we can do this for you as well for marketing videos and sales videos and sales materials, breaking things down, really showing you examples of how all this stuff works. If you'd like that, it's of great importance to leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel as well, share this with other people, really make this one hot, because I can create many more videos just like this for you. Huge value if you ask me. I enjoy doing these as well. Super practical as well. Again, Jonas Rhodes of the Rhodes Brothers. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time, and we will see you. Thank you and take care.